Okay, in this lecture, I'd like to discuss the various categories of amino acids that we will see in biochemistry and to categorize them as a function of their side chain or substituent group, as to whether it's nonpolar, polar, ionizable, etc. And for each of these, we're going to go through and look at the full name, the three-letter code, which can often be predicted by the name, and the one-letter code. And we'll find that the nonpolar or the hydrophobic residues are going to be those that are most simple, and that the three-letter code will often be very easily predicted by the full name. So hydrophobic amino acids are going to contain carbon, hydrogen, and maybe a carbon-sulfur sigma bond in the side chain. But there are no permanent dipoles. And the reason that they are nonpolar, or there's no permanent dipole, is because, of course, the electronegativity value of sulfur is equal to that of carbon, which is approximately equal to that of hydrogen. So there is no considerable difference in electronegativity, and therefore have nonpolar bonds.